Hi, everyone, and thanks for attending my NASH talk. My name is Michelle Sikes. I'm an assistant professor at Penn State, and the title of my talk today is 1/10 of a Second Does Not Really Count, Humphrey Cosey, Olympic Ultimatums, and the Tortured Logic of the South African Amateur Athletic Union of 1962. 1/10 of a second does not really count, declared Matt Murray, the president of the White South African Amateur Athletic Union in late April 1962, regarding the prospect of Humphrey Cosey joining the South African track and field team bound for an international meet in Lourenço Marques. Cosey's qualifying time in the half mile bettered that of the white runner who made the team. Minister of the Interior, Jan de Klerk, stated 2 months previously that the apartheid government opposed allowing Black athletes to compete with white athletes at international events. Despite announcing that they would pick athletes solely on the basis of merit, the South African Amateur Athletic Union selected a team made up entirely of white athletes, thereby denying inclusion of Black runners whose times bettered those of selected white runners. The move signaled to the IOC the emptiness of earlier promises by South African Olympic delegates to select athletes on merit alone. 1 month to the day after the Lourenço Marques track and field meet, the IOC issued an ultimatum to the South African Olympic Committee that if it failed to overcome governmental opposition to merit-based selection, South Africa would be suspended from the 1964 Tokyo Games, a threat on which they followed through, making the 1964 Olympics the first games missed by a South African team since starting to participate in 1908. South Africa's place in the Olympics is seriously in jeopardy, announced the Johannesburg-based daily newspaper, the Rand Daily Mail, on March 31st, 1962. Addressing the House of Assembly in Cape Town, Minister of the Interior de Klerk affirmed what his predecessor had established in 1956, namely that the government opposed sporting contact between athletes of different races. De Klerk also declared that he disapproved of Black athletes leaving the country with white athletes as members of South African teams with the words, quote, "Government policy is still that no mixed team should take part in sports inside and outside of South Africa." For Olympic officials, de Klerk's words appeared to rule out selecting Black athletes for a single South African Olympic team bound for Tokyo, thus officially breaking a promise made to the IOC 3 years before by Reginald Honey, then the South African Olympic Games Association president. Honey informed that body in 1959 that South Africa would send Black athletes to the Games if they met international standards for selection. The IOC accepted Honey's assurances, which forestalled a movement to ban South Africa from the 1960 Rome Olympics. For the next 3 years, Olympic officials maintained that their government would allow Black South African athletes to compete at the Olympic Games. An international track and field meet in Lourenço Marques, 1 month after de Klerk's statement, offered the first opportunity to test the government's resolve in a non-contact sport in which times offered a common point of reference. If South African sport officials chose to name athletes to the Springbok team on merit, Black competitors might, for the first time, compete together with white athletes under the South African flag at an international meet. Shortly after, Minister of the Interior de Klerk warned that he viewed mixed-race South African teams competing in neighboring territories in a, quote, unfavorable light. Track and field officials declared their intention to select a Springbok team on merit to compete against Portuguese and Rhodesian athletes in Lourenço Marques on May 5th and 6th, 1962. Quote, "We will send South Africa's best athletes," declared the secretary of the South African Amateur Athletic Union. Quote, "If a non-white sprinter records a faster time than the white runner, the non-white will be selected. It is not a question of color. We will send the best athletes." End quote. South Africa held 2 separate meets along racial lines from which the best athletes would be chosen to make the team. 2 athletes per event would be selected after the all-white track and field championship in Queenstown and a second trial for Black athletes held in Welkom the following weekend. The Star summed up the situation, quote, "The selection of Blacks would provide a test case for the government's policy on mixed teams. The outcome will have a profound effect on South Africa's future in international sport," end quote. Bennett Makamate, quote, "blazing over the last furlong of the track," end quote, lengthened his stride as he wound around the Western Holdings track, quote, "far ahead of his nearest rival," end quote, according to journalist Paul Irwin's post-race report. He finished the 3-mile event 200 yards ahead of second place in a time that was 13.8 seconds faster than that of the white runner at the Queenstown Championships the previous weekend. Humphrey Cosey, the surprise of the trials, then won the 880 yards in a time that beat the championship mark of white reserve runner Alf Bland by 1/10 of a second. As Irwin declared, quote, "If the South African Athletic Association officials accept the evidence of the stopwatch, and there is no reason why they shouldn't, then, according to the selection procedure as stated prior to the meet, Kosi and Makamate should become the first Black athletes to represent South Africa on an official mixed race team, thereby, quote, striding into international sporting history," end quote. The same weekend as the trials in Belcom, Henk Altman, a white student at the University of Cape Town, who finished runner-up in the 3-mile event at the White Championships in Queenstown, set a South African university's record in a 3-mile race in Grahamstown. His time there was 3.8 seconds faster than what Makamate recorded when he won the event by half a lap in Belcom the same day. Altman's time, recorded at a meet that was not the qualifying venue, presented another dilemma that should never have been considered. If South African officials named Altman to the team based on his Grahamstown performance, they would renege on the ground rules established for the Queenstown and Belcom trials in a bankrupt attempt to save face. Makamate beat Altman's time set at Queenstown by a significant margin. As one journalist stated, he was, quote, "obviously seconds faster than his time at Belcom, where he ran virtually on his own and never once was given that extra push by a challenger." The reporter then asked, quote, "Will the SAAU executive forget all about their decision to judge the claims of white and non-white athletes on the time set at Queenstown and Belcom?" Adding that Makamate, quote, "richly deserves Springbok selection and that it would be, quote, the cruelest luck, to say the least, if he did not." On the morning of April 30th, 1962, South African Amateur Athletic Union President Matt Murray announced that Black athletes would not be included in the South African team sent to Lourenço Marques. Instead, officials named UCT student Henk Altman for his most recent 3-mile time that bettered what Makamate recorded at Belcom, but fell short of the star distance runner's best performance that season. Asked about Kosi, who had beaten the time of the white reserve in the half-mile, Murray admitted that Kosi was, quote, "on the verge of selection," end quote, but the white runner would travel because, quote, "1/10 of a second does not really count." After all the controversy, the all-white South African team went on to win the meet in Lourenço Marques, well ahead of second place Portugal and third place Rhodesia. The same weekend, the South African non-European Championship took place over 2 days at Umtata. Kosi won the 440 yards and came second in the half-mile. Makamate won the 6 miles in a non-white record time that was 41 seconds better than the winning mark at the White Championships in Queenstown. He also won the 3 miles in a time that bettered both his own African record for the event and the winning time at the Queenstown Championships. His performance that day would have placed Makamate ahead of both white South Africans at the Lourenço Marques 5,000 meters. 1 month after these meets, the IOC warned the South African Olympic Committee that it would be suspended if the government refused to adjust its apartheid sport policy. To which de Klerk responded, quote, "I would rather see South Africa boycotted in the world of sports than give an inch on nationalist policy." He added, quote, "any concession would mean the beginning of the end of white civilization in South Africa." end quote. De Klerk claimed that any inconsistency in apartheid in sport would end the way of life that positioned the white South African minority at the apex of the country's economic, political, and social hierarchies. Against that outcome, for white sport authorities, what was 1/10 of a second, indeed? Unwilling to challenge his claim that 2 Black runners representing South Africa abroad was tantamount to the collapse of apartheid, track and field authorities ignored the efforts of athletes deserving of selection by changing the clearly stated rules, and ultimately by giving selective preference to white athletes. Caught between the antithetical positions of the IOC, which enshrined non-discrimination as a fundamental rule, and the South African government, which insisted that only white athletes could represent the country, the South African Amateur Athletic Union sought to preserve a veneer of merit-based selection in ways that fooled no one. While several rounds of negotiations would occur leading up to South Africa's eventual suspension from the 1964 Olympic Games, the events of 1962 contributed to the first ever threat by the IOC to suspend apartheid South Africa. This episode was a critical litmus test for demonstrating to the IOC how South African officials would respond to the demands of apartheid. Rather than challenge the government by forcing it to refuse passports to deserving Black runners, the Amateur Athletic Union backed down, thereby reneging on their promise to select Black athletes who merited inclusion and exposing yet again the tortured logic brought about by apartheid policy in South Africa. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.